Welcome to the deep dive. Okay, so you've brought us quite a stack of sources here. We've got articles, research papers, historical notes, and they're all focused on, well, a pretty complex and often controversial topic, the history of polygamy in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Yeah, it's definitely a topic with a lot of history, a lot of layers. So our mission today really is to get into this material with you, pull out the most important insights, try to understand the different perspectives these sources offer,
Mhm.
and really get a grip on how this practice shaped not just a religion, but, the nation as well.
Absolutely. It's a history that seems packed with, well, deeply held faith on one side, huge societal conflict on the other, doctrines that changed over time, and legacies that are still felt today.
Definitely.
So let's just dive right in and see what we can uncover together from all this.
Okay, first things first, let's get our definitions straight because the sources are pretty precise about this. When we say polygamy, that's like the umbrella term for multiple spouses.
Right.
But this specific form practiced by the early LDS Church, the one we're really talking about based on these sources, was polygyny. That's one man married to multiple women.
And that's crucial, right? Because it's distinct from polyandry, one woman, multiple husbands. And the sources show early LDS leaders explicitly condemned that.
Exactly. Condemned it. And stepping back a bit, it's really important to see this practice in a wider historical context. Polygyny wasn't, unique to early Mormonism, not at all.
Okay.
Your sources point out that before the industrial era, it was actually accepted, sometimes even preferred, in something like 3/4 of societies globally.
3/4. Wow.
Yeah, though often for practical reasons, it was kind of limited to the wealthy elite, the ones who could actually afford to support multiple families.
That makes sense. Resources, like the example mentioned here, the King of Marina, 12 wives. That sounds like consolidation.
It really highlights that, yeah. The sources suggest polygyny was often tied to, well, consolidating wealth, boosting labor power, because women's productive and reproductive labor was essentially hoarded by one man, you could say,
Right.
building political power, and, of course, ensuring plenty of heirs. It was often a system about resources and influence, fundamentally.
And the sources also point back to the Bible, right? Old Testament figures.
Right. Figures like Abraham, Jacob, David, Solomon, they practiced polygamy. It's in the text. Though the sources also note the texts record problems that came from it, and it wasn't necessarily encouraged as the standard for everyone.
And then the New Testament and early Christianity shifted more towards monogamy.
Largely, yeah. The
Yeah.
emphasis changed. Some Jewish groups had already started criticizing polygamy by then, too.
Okay, so this ancient and biblical context is important because why? How did the LDS practice differ?
Well, it's significant because while polygyny existed elsewhere for these, pragmatic or customary reasons, the LDS Church presented its practice not just as tradition, but as a divinely mandated religious principle.
Ah, okay.
And this was happening in the middle of an industrializing America that was predominantly monogamous. They framed it as a spiritual necessity, a restoration of ancient principles, as the sources put it.
And that's what set it on a collision course with mainstream American society and Christian views.
Yeah.
That divine mandate claim.
Exactly, which is why it became so controversial. Today, of course, the global trend is away from it, and it's illegal here in the U.S.
Okay, so with that context set, let's zoom in. How did this actually start within the LDS Church? The sources point to Joseph Smith, the founder.
Yes, he's the one who introduced plural marriage, and accounts suggest he received revelations about it surprisingly early, maybe as far back as 1831.
1831, wow. But it wasn't practiced openly then, surely.
Oh, no, definitely not. There's this fascinating detail in the sources about an angel reportedly directing him to practice and introduce it in 1834.
An angel.
Yeah, but the monogamous norms of the time, and probably just the shock of the doctrine itself, made openly adopting it incredibly difficult. The sources suggest this was a major hurdle.
So how did he start? Was it like a public announcement?
Not at all. That's part of the complexity. Smith's practice began very quietly, very discreetly. In the mid-1830s, Fanny Alger is often mentioned as possibly the first.
Okay.
By the early 1840s, when they were in Nauvoo, Illinois, he was introducing it, but only to a trusted inner circle. They were entering into confidential sealings or marriages. The formal revelation, the one that's now in their scripture as D&C 132, wasn't even dictated until July 12, 1843.
So a really gradual, very secretive process initially, that secrecy, that phased introduction. That seems pretty significant for understanding why it became so controversial later, the accusations of deception and all that.
Absolutely. The sources describe the doctrine as explosive enough that it had to be kept quiet at first, shared only with those considered completely trustworthy.
And what was the main theological reason given? Why did this revelation say it was necessary?
According to these sources, the core justification was a direct command from God. It was rooted in a principle from the Book of Mormon, which basically says monogamy is the rule unless the Lord commands otherwise,
To do what, specifically?
to raise up seed unto him.
Raise up seed. What did that mean in practice? Just having lots of kids?
That was a big part of it, yeah, bringing spirits to earth through procreation. But it was also interpreted more broadly, like ensuring all faithful women could be married and have families, which was seen as essential for reaching the highest level of salvation, what they call exaltation.
So it was tied to salvation itself.
Very much so. Rejecting this commandment, this plural marriage covenant, was taught to lead to damnation. It wasn't just an option. It was framed as the ideal marriage form, a restoration of biblical practice.
Okay, so divine command, raising posterity, ensuring salvation, big theological weight. Then, after Joseph Smith's death, Brigham Young leads the saints west to Utah. And that's when it becomes much more public.
Yes, exactly. Young officially announced the practice to the world on August 29, 1852. That date is a huge shift, moving from the sort of clandestine practice in Nauvoo to a public, openly declared doctrine in the Utah Territory.
And here's something that really jumps out from the sources, and it creates this, I don't know, fascinating tension. Despite that big theological emphasis on raising seed, having children, the sources consistently note that Joseph Smith himself had no known children from any of his plural wives.
That is a critical point the sources bring up repeatedly. 0 known children. It definitely makes you question the relationship between the stated divine purpose and the actual implementation, at least in his case.
Right. If raising seed was the primary command, how do you square that with the fact that the prophet who received the command didn't seem to fulfill it in that specific way with those wives?
Especially when you contrast it with Brigham Young, who, as the sources state, had 56 children with his plural wives. It prompts you to consider if maybe their personal practices or even their primary focus differed somehow. And it certainly complicates this simple lustful motives argument sometimes used against Smith. It adds layers.
It definitely adds layers.
Huh.
Okay, so setting aside the divine command for a second, what other motivations do the sources discuss for these early LDS leaders? From the LDS perspective, I mean, beyond salvation and posterity.
Well, Brigham Young, for instance, publicly talked about perceived social benefits. He argued it could actually help solve societal problems like prostitution by making sure every woman had the chance to be married, have a husband, and a home.
Interesting, like a social solution.
Yeah. Early on, there were also some now debunked theories floating around about a supposed surplus of women in Utah, or even health benefits. But the sources are very clear. Those lack support and aren't things the church promotes today.
Okay. And what about the critics? What motives did they suggest, especially for Joseph Smith?
Oh, the critics definitely focused on what they saw as ulterior motives. Accusations of lustful motives or a voracious sexual appetite directed at Joseph Smith are really common in the critical historical accounts we looked at.
Right.
Some also suggested he used it for personal power, maybe even monetary gain, although the sources note the evidence for financial gain is pretty disputed. There's also that accusation, though generally unsupported, that he sent men away on missions specifically to steal their wives while they were gone.
And for Brigham Young, was it also seen as a way to consolidate power for him and the leadership?
Absolutely. The sources are quite clear that the structure of polygyny, much like in ancient societies, inherently concentrated productive and reproductive labor and therefore power in the hands of a few dominant men.
So it benefited the hierarchy.
Significantly. Leaders like Brigham Young, with, over 50 wives, could wield immense social control. They could influence marriage prospects throughout the community. It's interesting, Brigham Young himself kind of shrewdly pointed out the hypocrisy he saw in the national outrage. He suggested the big outcry wasn't just about multiple partners per se, but maybe more about the fact that Mormons were allowing a wider group of people to openly break the rules of monogamy, not just the elite doing it secretly like elsewhere in society.
That's a provocative thought. So we've talked about leaders, but what about the regular members? How did they experience this? Was it easy to accept?
Oh, definitely not easy for many. For the early saints, accepting polygamy is often described in these sources as an incredibly hard test. We see quotes from members calling it an offensive, disgusting doctrine, something really difficult to
I
accept.
can imagine.
It led to intense persecution from outsiders, obviously, but also created really difficult family dynamics within the community and put a huge financial strain on households trying to support multiple families. It wasn't universally embraced,
Hmm.
you know. Some members chose not to practice it, and others left the church completely over it.
That quote you mentioned earlier from Sarah Pratt, the first wife of an apostle, that really paints a stark picture of the internal struggle.
It does. She said polygamy completely demoralizes good men and makes bad men correspondingly worse, and that left first wives desperate or else heartbroken, mean-spirited creatures. Accounts like that in the sources really speak to the profound personal and emotional toll this took on many people, especially women.
Let's dig into some of the specifics the sources provide about key figures. Joseph Smith, the numbers are pretty striking.
They are. He's estimated to have had somewhere between 30 and 40 wives. And again, critically, no known children from those plural unions. The allegations against him are serious and numerous, as laid out in these sources.
Like what?
Things like marrying women who were already living in his own home, which critics see as exploiting vulnerability, using older, trusted wives to help recruit younger women into the practice, the whole angel with a drawn sword narrative, which critics interpret as a coercive threat.
Right, we'll come back to that.
Marrying underage girls, Helen Mar Kimball is the name most often cited, sealed to him at age 14. Entering into polyandrous marriages, meaning marrying women who are still legally married to other living men, and using what's been called spiritual extortion, leveraging his prophetic authority and the threat of damnation to get women to agree.
And Brigham Young's practice, it was different in scale, right?
Significantly different. Brigham Young had many more wives, the sources often cite 55, and he fathered 56 children with his plural wives. That includes wives who were teenagers when they married him or bore children.
And the allegations against him.
They include his very public promotion of the practice, descriptions of having strict control over his large household, making comments that are seen today as, deeply misogynistic, and facing detailed public accusations of tyrannical abuse from a former wife, Annalisa Young, after she famously divorced him. The sources also draw a line, noting that child marriage persists as an issue in some fundamentalist groups today that trace their origins back to this early LDS practice.
Okay, let's delve a bit deeper into the nature of these relationships, specifically sexual relations and these serious allegations of abuse. The sources mention two types of sealings or marriages.
Yeah, they make a distinction. There were time and eternity sealings, which were understood to be for this life and the next, and could potentially include sexual relations. And then there were eternity-only sealings, which were seen as commitments just for the afterlife, supposedly without physical intimacy in this life.
And here's that contrast again between Smith and Young regarding sexual relations.
Right. It's really stark in the sources. For Joseph Smith, the evidence suggests less than half of his plural unions were actually consummated, and even in those, sexual relations might have been infrequent. Remember, 9 children with his first wife, Emma, but no credible evidence he had sexual relations with his youngest wives, like the 14-year-olds, or with the women in polyandrous sealings who were still living with their civil husbands.
But, and this is important, some plural wives did explicitly state they had sexual relations with him.
Yes, absolutely. The historical record includes those testimonies. But compare that overall picture to Brigham Young, who fathered 56 children with his plural wives, including teens. That strongly indicates much more widespread sexual relations within his plural families.
And the sources suggest this difference is critical.
It is. It complicates narratives. As the sources point out, this difference in childbearing makes the simple lust argument against Smith more complex. It might suggest different ways they implemented the practice, or perhaps different primary purposes they emphasized personally.
Okay, beyond just whether sex occurred, critics point to specific instances of alleged coercion and abuse by Joseph Smith. Marrying girls under 16 is a huge one.
It is. Marrying Helen Mar Kimball at 14, as documented in the sources, raises profound ethical questions about child marriage and the use of immense religious authority over someone so young and potentially vulnerable.
And that practice of polyandry, marrying already married women, that seems especially contentious in these sources.
Hugely contentious. Critics look at that and see genuine polyandrous relationships, implying sexual relations with women married to other men. However, many LDS sources argue these were likely eternity-only sealings, only taking effect after death, and they maintain Smith condemned sexual polyandry.
So there are conflicting interpretations in the sources themselves.
Definitely. It highlights the difficulty in knowing the exact nature of these relationships definitively from this distance in time. The sources present both sides of that debate.
Now, that angel with a drawn sword story, critics point to that as a specific coercive tactic.
Yes, frequently. The narrative is that Smith claimed an angel appeared to him 3 times with a drawn sword, threatening him with destruction if he didn't fully implement plural marriage. Critics interpret this as a powerful tool to pressure reluctant women into compliance.
Yeah.
By leveraging his prophetic authority, an angel told me to do this, and told me you must agree, and tying refusal directly to divine punishment or eternal damnation. It frames acceptance not just as desired, but as religiously essential, backed by a threat. That's seen as spiritual coercion.
And other tactics mentioned in the sources that critics point to.
Things like marrying women who are already living in his household, potentially exploiting a situation of dependence. Using older, already sealed wives who are trusted figures to persuade or recruit younger women. And employing significant secrecy and sometimes outright deception, like staging what critics call mock weddings to keep the practice hidden from his first wife, Emma, and from the general public initially.
So it really sounds like this question of abuse is tangled up with the question of consent, especially within that kind of hierarchical religious structure.
Exactly. The sources really grapple with this. While some LDS accounts emphasize the faith and agency of the women who chose to enter these marriages, critics argue that the sheer weight of Smith's authority, combined with the angel narrative and the threats of damnation, created immense pressure.
Which calls into question our modern understanding of free consent.
Precisely. Can consent be truly free under that kind of spiritual pressure and power dynamic? That's the core of the critical argument presented in these sources.
And allegations of abuse weren't limited to Smith, as you mentioned earlier.
No. Sarah Pratt specifically criticized Brigham Young's obsession with marrying younger women. And Annalisa Young, his 19th wife, went public with detailed allegations of tyrannical abuse after their divorce, which became a national sensation. And again, critics today connect ongoing issues like child marriage and the treatment of women as property in some fundamentalist groups back to what they see as negative precedents set during this historical period. Plus, Brigham Young's recorded comments that are now seen as deeply misogynist.
Okay, so this practice is established mainly out in Utah, but it's causing major waves across the rest of the United States.
Oh, huge waves. Polygamy was arguably the single most controversial thing about early Mormonism for outsiders. The sources talk about widespread wrath and vitriol. It became a massive political and cultural flashpoint.
And the Republican Party famously got involved early on.
They did. In their 1856 platform, they denounced polygamy alongside slavery as one of the twin relics of barbarism. That framing was incredibly powerful. It explicitly linked Mormon polygamy to slavery and positioned both as fundamentally anti-American threats to national identity and morality.
So public opinion was fiercely against it.
Overwhelmingly.
Yeah.
Fueled by sensationalized novels, political cartoons, think caricatures of Brigham Young with dozens of unhappy wives and loud condemnation from religious groups, women's groups, and politicians who saw it as immoral. Degrading to women, the term white slavery was often used.
Wow.
And a threat to democracy, the traditional family, and Christian civilization itself.
Although interestingly, the sources do mention some non-Mormon observers at the time, like that Captain Howard Stansbury, who actually reported seeing polygamist families that seemed functional and harmonious.
That's true. Those accounts offer a counter-narrative, suggesting the reality on the ground might have been more varied than the purely negative public image. But those were definitely minority reports. The dominant narrative was one of condemnation.
And that intense opposition eventually led to concrete action from the government.
Yes, a whole series of increasingly tough federal laws aimed specifically at wiping out polygamy.
Can you walk us through those briefly?
Sure. The sources detail them. First was the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act in 1862, making polygamy illegal in U.S. territories like Utah. Then the Poland Act in 1874 shifted power in Utah's courts to federal judges, making it easier to prosecute polygamists.
Okay.
Then the Edmunds Act in 1882 really upped the ante. It made just living together unlawful cohabitation illegal, even without proof of a marriage ceremony. And crucially, it took away the right to vote or hold office from anyone practicing polygamy.
It's enfranchisement.
Exactly. And finally, the Edmunds-Tucker Act of 1887 was the hammer blow. It made unrecorded plural marriages felonies, forced wives to testify against their husbands, disinherited children from plural marriages, and maybe most significantly authorized the federal government to seize almost all of the LDS Church's property, including temples, potentially.
And the Supreme Court backed these laws.
They did. The key case was Reynolds v. United States in 1879. The court ruled that while the Constitution protects religious belief, it does not protect religious practices that violate general laws. So the government could ban polygamy. That was a huge legal defeat for the church.
So this relentless legal pressure, it must have been the major roadblock to Utah getting statehood for all those years.
Absolutely. The sources make it crystal clear. Polygamy was the reason Utah's numerous petitions for statehood were rejected time and time again. Congress wasn't going to admit a state that openly defied federal law on such a controversial issue.
And here's where the story takes another fascinating turn, intersecting with the women's suffrage movement.
Yeah, that connection is really interesting. Utah Territory actually gave women the right to vote pretty early, back in 1870.
Why did they do that?
Well, the sources suggest it was partly a strategic move by Mormon leaders. They hoped to demonstrate to the rest of the country that Mormon women weren't oppressed victims of polygamy, that they were capable citizens, and maybe gain some sympathy or support for statehood.
But it didn't quite work out that way, did it? It caused a split in the national suffrage movement.
It did. Many national suffragists were actually hoping that enfranchised Utah women would vote against polygamy and end it from within. But then you had groups like the Ladies' Anti-Polygamy Society of Utah, formed in 1878, mostly non-Mormon women and some ex-Mormons.
Right.
They actively lobbied Congress for stricter anti-polygamy laws, arguing that Mormon women were too controlled by the church hierarchy to vote independently against polygamy. And you also had figures like Annalisa Young, Brigham Young's divorced wife, touring the country, using her personal story to link polygamy to slavery and argue against it from a women's rights perspective.
So women's rights wasn't some monolithic idea. It was interpreted very differently depending on your perspective on polygamy, religion, and politics.
Exactly. It shows the complexity of social movements. This tension continued until the church officially moved to end polygamy. After that, Utah finally achieved statehood in 1896. And significantly, women's suffrage was written back into its state constitution.
Okay, so let's get to that ending. How did the church actually stop practicing polygamy? Was it a sudden revelation, a change of heart?
Well, the sources emphasize it wasn't like flipping a switch. It was a really complex, gradual process. And the main driver, according to these sources, was that intense, unrelenting external pressure from the U.S. government.
So less a theological shift initially, more a pragmatic adaptation for survival.
That's certainly what the immediate context strongly suggests. The pivotal moment was the 1890 manifesto, issued by the church president at the time, Wilford Woodruff. This document, which is now part of their official scripture.
Official Declaration 1, right.
Right. It was a direct response to those escalating federal laws. The church being disincorporated, its assets being seized, leaders going to prison, the very real threat of losing their temples.
So Woodruff's manifesto basically declared submission to U.S. law?
Essentially, yes. He stated his intention to submit to the laws of the land and advised church members to do the same. He denied that any new plural marriages were being sanctioned by the church. This manifesto was absolutely critical for paving the way to Utah's statehood, which required a ban on polygamy in its constitution.
But crucially, the sources say it didn't just stop overnight.
No, definitely not. That's another layer. For many leaders and members, it was hard to abandon a principle they'd believed in so deeply, suffered persecution for, and seen as divinely commanded. Many initially view the manifesto as maybe a temporary measure, a way to appease the government.
So people continued living in existing plural marriages.
Yes. Many continued living with and supporting their existing plural wives and families, often having more children well into the 20th century. The sources even note that church leaders sometimes condemned men who tried to use the manifesto as an excuse to just abandon those families.
And were there actually new plural marriages still happening after 1890?
Yes. The sources confirm a smaller number of new plural marriages were performed quietly after the 1890 manifesto. Mostly outside the U.S., in places like Mexico and Canada where U.S. law didn't reach, but some apparently happened within the U.S. too, although the authorization for those is often unclear.
How many are we talking about?
One ledger mentioned in the sources covering 1890 to 1903 shows about 25 plural marriages out of roughly 315 total marriages recorded. So it was persistent, though clearly declining. These sometimes had quiet approval from top leaders, but oversight seems to have been inconsistent.
And this continuation, even on a small scale, caused more problems down the line.
It did. When evidence of these post-manifesto plural marriages became public knowledge, especially during those contentious Reed-Smoot Senate hearings in the early 1900s.
Right, where Senator Smoot's seat was challenged because he was a Mormon apostle.
Exactly. It caused a huge amount of political trouble and public embarrassment for the church. It became clear a stronger, more definitive statement was needed.
Which led to the Second Manifesto.
Correct. In 1904, President Joseph F. Smith issued what's known as the Second Manifesto. This declaration was much more explicit. It prohibited all new plural marriages anywhere in the world and stated clearly that anyone performing or entering into such a marriage would be excommunicated.
And this one stuck.
This one was formally approved by church leadership councils and sustained by the general membership and conference. It marked the definitive end of official church sanction for any new plural marriages. Disciplinary actions followed, including against high-ranking leaders like apostles who defied it. Existing plural families continued to live together for decades, but 1904 was the authoritative cutoff for new church-sanctioned plural marriages.
And this period, this transition, is also when we see the beginning of modern Mormon fundamentalist groups.
Absolutely. Their emergence is a direct result of this period. These groups broke away from the mainstream church, precisely because they believed polygamy was an eternal commandment that the church had wrongly abandoned, essentially compromising with the world to survive.
So they see the manifestos very different.
Completely differently. Not as divinely guided adaptation, but as apostasy, a betrayal of Joseph Smith's revelations. Many trace their claims to continued priesthood authority to perform plural marriages back to specific individuals like Lauren C. Woolley from around this time, claiming a secret ordination.
So it's a fundamental disagreement about revelation and authority.
Exactly. It led to a permanent schism. And the sources are very clear. Today, these fundamentalist groups practicing polygamy are entirely separate from and not recognized by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which, as we've said, strictly prohibits polygamy and excommunicates members who practice it.
Wow. Okay, so just to try and pull this all together, this incredibly complex history starts with Joseph Smith's revelations, driven by theological reasons, raising seed, eternal salvation, but also deeply tangled with social structures and power within the church hierarchy.
Right, which then slammed into intense national opposition, framed politically as fighting barbarism, leading to those harsh federal laws, the crucial Reynolds Court decision, and ultimately forcing the church's hand to gain statehood for Utah.
And the story gets even more layered with that unexpected intersection with the women's suffrage movement, showing how even something like women's rights could be interpreted in conflicting ways depending on your stance on polygamy and religion.
And the end wasn't simple either. It was a phased, pragmatic adaptation driven mainly by that external government pressure of the two manifestos, which in turn led to that permanent split with fundamentalist groups who hold a fundamentally different view on church authority and continuing revelation.
And where does that leave the mainstream church today regarding polygamy?
Today, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints strictly prohibits polygamy, period. Monogamy is the only accepted form of marriage. Any members found practicing plural marriage face excommunication. That policy has been firmly in place and consistently enforced for over a century now.
But it's clear from the sources that this history isn't just, ancient history. It still resonates.
Oh, definitely. It remains a sensitive and, as the sources describe it, a divisive issue even within the church sometimes. It prompts ongoing internal discussion, historical reckoning, and certainly external scrutiny. It's not something that's just been forgotten. Scholarly debate continues about the motivations of the early leaders, the incredibly complex nature of consent within that specific historical and religious context, and the long-term impact it had on individuals and on the church's identity.
Wow. That was truly a deep dive into this material on LDS polygamy. We've really covered a lot of ground. The origins, the complex motivations, the heavy criticisms leveled at leaders, the challenging realities for the people who actually lived it, that intense national backlash and the legal battles, and finally, its gradual end and the lasting legacy, including that split with the fundamentalist groups.
Yeah, it's very clear from these sources, this wasn't some simple black and white story. It's deeply intertwined with faith, certainly, but also with power, law, culture, and shifting societal norms over time.
So as you've listened along with us through this deep dive, what stands out most to you? How does understanding this specific history maybe shape your perspective on that broader relationship between deeply held religious practice and the laws and values of the wider society it finds itself in?
It really brings up a fundamental question, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What happens when the perceived dictates of faith, Things people believe God has commanded clash head-on with the laws and dominant values of the surrounding society. How does an institution, how do individuals navigate that kind of profound conflict? And how do they adapt or choose not to adapt over time?
That is definitely something to mull over. Thank you for bringing us this really fascinating and complex topic to explore together today.